What's up guys, JV2017 here, and this video is going to be about Ken Levine's Game Developers Conference talk this year about what he calls replayable narrative gameplay. Now if you have no idea what this means, it's okay. Basically this video, I'm not gonna try to replicate his speech or anything, but I just want to talk about some of the implications of his ideas and systems and whatnot. But anyways, if you have no idea what this is, but you are still interested, links in the description below to the hour-long video, which is his speech presentation at the GDC, as well as a Q&A session where people ask him questions, and that, of course, reveals more information about what Mr. Ken Levine has on his mind. If you don't know who Ken Levine is, he is the mastermind behind BioShock in general, all BioShock. He also did System Shock, Freedom Force, other games, but those are older games you probably haven't heard of. Anyways, Ken Levine's been around for a long time, and he is considered an industry great when it comes to video games and narrative. He's a brilliant writer and all of these things. So basically, in this video that I'm referring to, this game GDC, by the way, GDC is the Game Developers Conference. It's a yearly thing, and I believe game developers go, and I don't know if the press is necessarily invited. I think the press is invited because, maybe the press can get some things, some indication of something to report on, perhaps, by going to the GDC. Anyways, so that's what that is. So he was giving a presentation on what he calls replayable narrative gameplay. Now, he kind of went through and described, hey, I've been making the same kind of game for a long time now, and that's linear narratives. And that's literally, linear means one path. It's point A to point B to point C to point D. There's nothing else going on in between. He explained some of the challenges. It's very expensive, but most of the time it's authorally driven, which means it's driven by the author, the writer, the person who creates this story. You're basically, it's a video game, so you have this interactivity. However, you don't really get to decide, what point A to point B is. In most games that are out today, that's pretty much how it happens. There is a clearly defined starting point and a clearly defined ending point to most of these games. And what I think Ken Levine wants to do with this idea is abandon everything we think we know about how a narrative game should be played and scrap it and, replace it with what he calls a replayable narrative, which the key thing here with the replayable narrative is that each action and event that happens in the game is player driven. Every single thing that you do relies on the decisions that you make. And some of the examples that he drawed upon, which make a lot of sense in my mind, are Civilization and XCOM. And Civilization is a game where, I'm sure you guys are familiar, but if you aren't, it's a game where you start very early, 4000 BC, and you take a civilization all the way to hopefully win and dominate the world through war and domination of every other place, culture, science, economic victory. There's all kinds of different victories, but basically in Civilization, you make these choices all along the way, and all of these choices influence what happens afterwards. And so what Ken Levine wants to do is incorporate that idea of all of these choices. Everything that even happens in the game is influenced by the player. It's 100% player driven. And it sounds extremely complex, but the way he kind of broke it down was, it's pretty simple system. So what he gave an example, and he kind of said that, this is kind of borrowed from Skyrim. So let's assume that we're in kind of a Skyrim-esque world. We're in that kind of medieval period, I guess you could say, quasi-medieval, and there are different factions that you can choose from, yada, yada, yada. Say there are 4 different villages with different races, okay? And in each village there are 5 what he calls stars, and I don't like that term, so I'm just going to say VIP, very important persons. There are 5 VIPs in each town, and those people they're characters, okay? And they're not like the most advanced AI ever, but they are characters, which means that they have passions. And what Ken Levine describes as a passion is something that the player does. Let's see. It's some characteristic of that character that the VIP cares about in relation to the player. So, for example, he used Frank the Orc. He's a blacksmith, okay? Let's say that Frank the Orc is a VIP in the Orc village. And Frank the Orc, one of his passions, and again, a passion is something that he cares about in relation to the player that will influence the world, that is also very readily obvious. You know, Frank will say, so I'll just give this example real quick. Frank doesn't like elves, okay? He hates elves. So he makes this very obvious to the player, which means that the player can go ahead and influence Frank and Frank's actions in the world. So if the player were to go kill some elves, Frank would then be happy with the player. And so that's the difference between just a simple characteristic with Frank. Like Frank has green skin because he's an orc, or he's got black hair, or, you know, Frank enjoys pancakes. You know, those are things that don't really matter, but passions are things that really do matter in relation to the player, which is Frank hates elves. If the player kills elves, it then influences Frank, which then can influence many things in the world. Now, Frank is not the only VIP in the Orc village. There are 4 other VIPs, okay? And all of their interchanging relationships affect each other. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, I don't really care about all this specific Frank the Orc, whatever, who cares, right? Well, let's just say there's not a main quest line in this Skyrim-esque game. There's no, you know, Dovahkiin bullshit, I'm Dragonborn, I need to kill. I can't even remember what the main quest line of Skyrim was. It wasn't even that. I think it was like something about, oh yeah, it was some kind of giant war. Who cares? But anyways, let's say that's not even real. There is no main quest line in this replayable narrative. It's literally you are dropped into this world with all of these characters. I mean, I think a better term for this, I know Ken Levine is just, you know, he's great, whatever. I love Ken Levine. But I like to think of a replayable narrative sandbox is the best word or phrase that I could, you know, coin what Ken Levine is talking about here. It's literally a world that the developers have created for the player to run around in and affect, but it's set up, you know, and it's not set up in a bad way. It's set up in a way that the player influences all of the actions that occur in the game. And I think it's a really exciting idea. And the problem is he gave a very, you know, if you watch the video, if you know what I'm talking about, he gave a very perfect example, a really good example with the Skyrim-esque world with the 4 villages and Frank the Orc and all this stuff. And there's much more complexity beyond what I talked about in this video, by the way, in his video. So again, I encourage you, go watch that. But it's hard for me to imagine this to fit in any other kind of world besides the world that he outlined. Maybe that's the reason I'm not a game developer. But anyways, really exciting stuff. And, you know, it's things like this that I listen to from game developers that almost make me want to make games. And it's always kind of been in the back of my head, in the back of my mind, you know, it would be really cool to make games. And, you know, that's not really the path I've chose, at least in college. But, you know, in order to be a game developer, I don't think it's necessary to take game development classes in college, or even SMART. Because apparently game developers don't hire only people that have game developer, you know, degrees and whatnot. I'm not saying I want to go into game development because of this. I'm just saying that would be something that's, I mean, that sounds really cool to me. And a lot of people are like, hey, you know, follow your dreams, man. And I wouldn't say that making video games are, is necessarily one of my dreams. However, it's something that sounds appealing to me at some point. And, you know, I don't know. Making a game sounds really cool. I don't know what you guys think, but that's just my thoughts. And talks like this really opened my mind to the possibilities of, hey, what would happen if I were to just drop everything and say, hey, you, and you, let's go make a game, you know? And of course, making games it's extremely expensive. And in this day and age, it only happens in indie space, really. Primarily, I'll say primarily it happens in an indie space, because I would say the last major studio or company, whatever you want to call it, that's risen up and, you know, to prominence would be Ubisoft, because Ubisoft has been around for a while, but it wasn't that important in my eyes until like Assassin's Creed came around. And then, of course, we got Watch Dogs and all this other stuff on the way. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this little talk here. I really like his ideas, and I hope Ken Levine brings us a very awesome game before the end of this new generation. I mean, seriously, it sounds like his ideas are in the stages of infancy. You know, they're not really fleshed out, but at the same time, he's got something here, is what I'm trying to say. And so I'm very excited to see what he has to bring for everyone and the video game industry. So hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you all later. Peace.